everyone. So we are going to start this panel discussion, Building a Resilient Economy, the Challenges of Inequality. This panel discussion marks the end of 2-day symposium on Towards a Resilient Economy. This panel discussion is organized by IEG and IIC. Before we formally start the panel discussion, I would request my colleague Dr. Sandhya Garg to give bouquet to Professor Chetan Ghate. Yeah.
Ask us to come and sit down.
Okay, sorry. So please, Professor Chetan Ghate, chair of the session, Professor Bina Agarwal, and all the 4 speakers, please. Yeah. So I request Dr. Sandhya Garg to give bouquet to Professor Chetan Ghate, Director IEG.
Thank you, Sandhya.
I would request Dr. Gautam to give bouquet to the chair of the session, Professor Bina Agarwal.
Yes, thank you.
I request Sandhya to give bouquet to Dr. Stephane Hallegatte. I request Gautam to welcome Professor E. Somanathan. I request Sandhya to welcome Dr. Radhika Khosla. And now I request Dr. Gautam to welcome Professor Ashwini Deshpande. So now I request Professor Bina Agarwal to take over the mic. Thank you.
So I warmly welcome everybody for today's panel, which is Building a Resilient Economy, the Challenge of Inequalities. And I will chair and moderate this session. Many of you know me, but in any case, I'm a professor of development economics and environment at the Global Development Institute, the University of Manchester in the UK, where I teach part-time. I'm also former director of the Institute of Economic Growth, where I'm still affiliated, and I have ongoing research projects. So the panel this evening, as Sukhdeep just said, is a conclusion of a 2-day high-level academic symposium, lots of graphs, towards a resilient economy, which was organized by the Institute of Economic Growth at its campus, which is at the Delhi University campus. But this evening's panel will focus specifically on the issue of resilience and inequality, on which I will say more in a minute. Now, the panel is organized in collaboration between the Institute of Economic Growth and the India International Center, and we warmly thank the IIC for the collaboration. We also acknowledge support from my International Balzan Foundation Prize Research Funds located at the IEG. So may I first request Professor Chetan Ghate, Director of IEG, to make some opening remarks.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this panel on resilience and inequality. First, let me also extend my thanks to the India International Center for partnering this very interesting panel on that we're going to have today. As you all know, the Institute of Economic Growth is well known to this audience. It was founded by V.K.R.B. Rao, who was a legendary institution builder. He started the Delhi School of Economics in 1949, IIG in 1952. He was instrumental in setting up ICSSR. He started the PRCs, the Population Research Council System, and many others, Isaac, and then he was a union minister of, I think, education and trade and so on. So he wore many hats and was a prolific scholar in national income product accounts. He did a lot of early work on calculating GDP in India in 1931 and 32. I think that was his PhD thesis, which was published in 1937, which he finished from Cambridge, and then continued throughout his career on measurement. And IIG then got that tradition and doing a lot of work on primary surveys, and that was really the thrust of which policies were based on. A lot of policy research based on primary surveys. But we have, as Bina just mentioned, we've just finished a wonderful and extremely enlightening workshop symposium on resilience. And I just wanted to say a few things and give you a few, some of the things that we picked up. And of course, the panel is going to talk about it a little bit more. But the concept of resilience is, I think, well known in macroeconomics, certainly. Although it's not in formal research, it's not written as resilience, but you're rebounding from shocks and you're getting back to things like steady state. So it's all there, but it's never called resilience. But what it means is its ability for economies, let's say, to rebound, right? And that is typically differentiated from robustness, which is the ability to resist. So resilience is also the ability to respond to shocks, and it's this ability to rebound. And sometimes policymakers hesitate to use the word resilience because it has this connotation of going back to where you started off from. But what you want is to actually build back better. So that was, Biden's, campaign slogan, which was then kind of taken over by many other politicians as well. So resilience has that connotation. But how do you think about resilience at the household level? How do you think about it at the firm level? And how do you think about it at the sectoral level, especially in the context of developing economies? So for instance, in this symposium that we've just concluded, there was a lot of discussion on resilience in agriculture and what it means. Now, there's a host of policies that deal with a host of issues in agriculture, such as water pricing, crop insurance, crop diversification. So you would think that resilience means one implication of resilience, of course, is that you should build up buffers, and buffers kind of become a virtue. But if you build up buffers as a stabilization tool, then there are all kinds of political issues associated with buffer dynamics, right? With using buffer as a stabilization tool. And if you think that the MSP procurement system has served India well in terms of making us food secure, then there is a sense also that has prevented crop diversification from happening. And crop diversification would be something that is an important part of resilience. So resilience is, when we kind of think about it, it's got these multifaceted aspects. It looks more complicated than it is at first. And so what this panel hopefully will help us do is navigate us through all of it. It's extremely complicated, but we have a great panel, and I'm looking forward to what they have to say on the topic. So a very warm welcome to you, and thank you, and good evening.
So I'm going to complicate it further. By the way, in case you haven't been to the Institute of Economic Growth, I would suggest that you do visit it, because we're next to the Delhi School of Economics, but we have 7 acres on the campus. So what as I said, as you've heard, resilience can mean many things, but especially the ability to recover from shocks. So resilient economy, one could say, is one that can withstand, recover from, even emerge stronger from shocks. Now, as you know, shocks can be economic, they can be climatic, like floods, cyclones, heat waves, they can be technological, they can be health-related, the latest being the pandemic, and they can impact on the country's financial systems, livelihoods, food systems, employment, industry, and so on. Now, many of you who've attended the IEG symposium for the past 2 days have already heard about the impact of these shocks from a variety of angles, especially in sectoral terms, as Professor Ghate has just laid out. But this evening, we'll examine the challenges of building a resilient economy through the lens of existing socioeconomic inequalities. Now, the vulnerability of economic, climatic, and other shocks, their impact and our recovery from them can be unequal across sectors. For instance, agriculture is more vulnerable than industry, across ecological zones and spatially, and across populations. So the impact can differ between, say, the formal and informal sector workers, between village and city dwellers, between households in diverse communities, and individuals within the household, for instance, between men and women, and so on. Now, these unequal outcomes are predicated on pre-existing socioeconomic inequalities, such as those of class, caste, gender, as well as location. So if we take income and wealth, for instance, by one estimate in 2022-23, the top 1% of India's adult population earned 22.6% of India's national income and owned 40% of the wealth. And these inequalities have been rising. So what happens is that in turn, these inequalities can affect how different people experience shocks and their ability to recover. Shocks can also be further exacerbated, and they further exacerbate inequalities, but not necessarily in a linear way. So for example, if we take sectoral inequalities, as I said, we know agriculture is much more at risk from climatic stress than, say, manufacturing. If you have heat waves, they tend to affect earnings and health of construction workers, street vendors, people in other informal sector workers, much more than inside factories or offices. And health effects and health shocks, such as we saw in the COVID pandemic and lockdown, as you remember all the images of the migrant workers who were hugely more vulnerable relative to all of us who were in steady jobs and we just locked ourselves in. So there are also inequalities in access to vaccines, hospitals, depending on your income, social position, but also, let's not forget, location. So if you're in the hill, on top of a hill, there are no health facilities. Moreover, the economic effects of shocks can have long-term effects on people's well-being and recovery. So suppose you have a shock and you're a poor family. You might become indebted initially because you've lost your job, and then you might even be forced to sell your productive assets. So if you're a farmer, you could mortgage your land or your livestock, and if you're in a city and you're a street vendor, you might have to sell your cart. So these are cumulative effects which undermine recovery and the ability to survive the next shock, and they can further exacerbate inequalities. So one can think of shocks as short-term and long-term, just as we think of COVID as immediate, and then there are long-term effects. Then there's a question of measurement. So in measuring an economy's recovery from shocks, we tend to fall back on this age-old measure, GDP growth. And that is the one measure which was, if you remember, most reported during and after COVID, whether GDP was growing or slowing down per quarter. And we heard rather less about the impact and recovery of people and their well-being, especially the most disadvantaged. So while GDP growth may well reduce the numbers of the vulnerable, it is not an adequate measure of a resilient economy in terms of people's well-being given high inequality. So for this, we need other granular measures and relevant data for measuring and monitoring. And similarly, we have a challenge for policy, given the multifaceted aspect of these challenges of shocks and inequalities. So we need to anticipate shocks and plan to cushion for them rather than just reacting at the last minute. So how do we build appropriate responses within diverse institutions, within the state, the market, communities, and households? So we may require lots of adjustments, like there's macroeconomic policies, the development of inclusive systems, relevant technologies and architectures, as well as regional and community cooperation. This is something that we did experience during COVID. But we must also ask, shouldn't we aim higher than simply seek to recover from shocks and return to the pre-shock situation? Shouldn't we aim to mitigate shocks and achieve a higher level of welfare? In fact, to build a resilient economy and society, we would need to reduce vulnerabilities to future disasters and shocks and identify new pathways, as Chetan just said, build back better. And this phrase, as you know, which emerged from COVID, of course, implies that we should think of out-of-the-box solutions, even change our lifestyles, as some have argued. In fact, perhaps we can say that in thinking of solutions, we need to find solutions, if that's possible, which both reduce shocks and reduce inequalities simultaneously. So with this, these complexities, our very distinguished panel of experts, they'll discuss many of these issues. They'll draw upon Indian and global experience. You already have their short bios and abstracts. But what I'll be doing as a moderator is that each panelist will speak for 10 minutes. about the nature of the problem. And then the difficult task, or a second round of 3 to 4 minutes, of giving us the directions for solutions. I'm saying directions because we may or may not have final solutions. And then we'll open it up for question and answers, both from the audience and also possible questions which the panelists may have to each other. So with those words, I'd like to invite our opening panelist, Dr. Stephane Hallegatte. He's a senior climate change advisor of the World Bank Climate Change Group. And of course, he has an extensive biography, which I'm not going to read out, but he's published extensively on the economics of natural disasters and risk management, among other topics. And he's also led the development of the resilience rating system at the World Bank. And in 2018, he received the Bertoni Award for his work on climate change adaptation and poverty reduction. So clearly, here's somebody who thinks not just about shocks and recoveries, but also the poor. So he will talk about the distributional impact of disasters and benefits in building resilience. So Stephane.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's really a great pleasure and a little bit of pressure to share the stage with this distinguished set of panelists. So let me try to just open with some remarks, and then in the last 3 minutes we'll solve all of the problems. So I wanted to get started with a little bit of how I started to work on climate change impacts, disaster impacts, and inequality. And it really started with the way at the World Bank we're assessing our projects. And so we'll start with a very simple example. Like, imagine you have 2 coastal protection projects, and you have to pick your favorite one, right? The one that you want to fund. The way we're supposed to do that by our policies is to do a cost-benefit analysis. And so if we do a cost-benefit analysis and we have like 2 projects costing $100 million and one is avoiding 20 million in losses per year and the other one 5, I won't ask for a show of hands, but I guess everyone wants the project with the 20 million. That's what we face every day when we're assessing our projects. And of course, very often we realize that the project avoiding the big losses is protecting fancy houses and rich populations, and the project avoiding fewer losses is protecting poor people. And it's not a surprise, right? The asset losses, when you have a disaster, you have to have assets to have asset losses. And so in places with rich populations, it's much easier to have large avoided losses thanks to disaster risk management. And of course, this is not satisfying, right? And the World Bank has a mandate of poverty reduction, so the contrast here was just too big. So the idea was really to think about how can we better capture the effect of disasters on people living in poverty, not through the asset that they will be losing in absolute value in dollars or in rupees, but more like capturing the real impact it has on people, their prospects, their future, and their well-being. And so what we did was just to start with the most traditional risk assessment that we do, right? So you might be familiar with that. When we do risk assessment, we start with what we call the hazard. So it's the physical event. So here, let's say a typhoon. It's a physical thing. Then we look at the exposure, which is the population and the assets that will be affected by the physical event. And then we look at the vulnerability, which is this population, those assets, when they're affected, how much damage they will suffer. And this is what we do and what insurers do to assess the asset losses in case of disasters. And if you have a disaster occurring the next day in newspapers, you will find those numbers, 43 billion, 300 million, and so on, that all of those numbers are assessments of the assets that have been lost, but they don't tell you much about what's happening to people. So what we proposed to do was to just add a little block at the end of this traditional risk assessment, which we called socioeconomic resilience. So I'm often saying that maybe we did not need one more definition of resilience because there are already too many, but it's too late now. And so this additional block is supposed to describe how the asset losses will translate into impact on people's well-being. And we define the resilience as the ratio of the two, right? So if you have an infinite resilience, you can lose all of the assets in the world and it won't affect your well-being. Bill Gates type situation. If you're a very poor farmer and you have a very low resilience, even losing a very small amount of assets will have a huge impact on your well-being and your resilience will be close to zero. So that's how we're saying. So very different from the initial definition of resilience, which is the ability to bounce back. Here, it's more the ability to experience asset losses without experiencing well-being losses. And so how do we do this assessment? Well, the only way of doing it is to do it at the household level. And I mean, I wish we could do it at the individual level. The data challenges means that we're doing it at the household level. And so we start from a description of households and their asset. I don't know if you know this photographer, but he's touring the world photographing households with everything they own. And it's fascinating to compare countries and all of their belongings. That's really where we start from. And then we take every household individually and we go through the steps, right? So if I still think about my typhoon, how much are they affected by winds and floods? Are they exposed? How much asset losses will they suffer? If they suffer asset losses, how will that translate into income losses? And if they suffer income losses, how will that translate into consumption losses? And that, of course, will depend on their savings, whether they have insurance, whether they are covered by social protection, a lot of different things that we have to look into. And then we have to translate the consumption losses into these well-being losses. And here we want to capture the fact that very rich people, if they have to pay $3,000 to repair their roof, they will cut on luxury consumption. For very poor households, they will cut on nutrition, kids' education, access to healthcare. So the value of $1 of consumption reduction will be much, much bigger in terms of well-being. So I won't go into too much details, but we start from household surveys, and we try to represent the impact and the recovery of individual households one by one. And so what does it look like? So I won't be long, but just to give you a little sense. When you're affected by a typhoon, you will experience losses, and two things will happen to you. One is it will reduce your income, either because you're deriving an income from your assets you own, or because of the factory, which is maybe owned by somebody else, will be affected and it will affect your income. So this is the first shock. The second shock is in the residual income that you have, you will have to use part of this income to replace the assets that have been lost. And so the consumption loss will be bigger than that. And of course, here I contrast on the left and the right. If you have access to liquid savings, if you have access to borrowing, you will be able to use these savings and borrowing so that you can reduce more your consumption because you can replace by your savings, and then you can rebuild very fast. If you don't have financial inclusion and you have to do with just your income, it will take you a very long time to repair. So it's not only about the magnitude of the shock at the time, it's also do you have the tools to replace your assets quickly and to restore your income quickly. So I wanted to illustrate that on the case of India, but this is very much work in progress, so don't look too much at the detailed numbers. But I think the lesson we see in all of the countries where we have been doing this type of analytics. On the left here, you have per quintile in the country, the losses in terms of assets. And you see that the fifth quintile, the richest, are losing much, much more. So if you're asking who is most vulnerable to disasters in terms of absolute losses, it's the richest. They have more assets to lose. They are losing more assets. They are the most vulnerable. If you target your interventions to minimize asset losses, you will invest only to help rich people. Now, if you do the different steps that I mentioned, this is what you see on the right, that it's completely reversed, right? The most affected are the poorest, and the richest, even though the absolute losses are big, in fact, they can manage that much better, and the welfare losses are lower. We can contrast different states as an illustration of the inequality by state. So you see here on the left, it's the resilience, so the ability to experience asset losses without losing welfare. And on the right, it's the resulting well-being losses. And one little calculation we did based on this, again, very preliminary analysis is even if all states were converging to the average state, only that would reduce by 30% the well-being losses in the country. So learning from the experience of different states, looking at what works would be a very good way to start, because some states have been doing a better job, and what they have been doing can be replicated in other places. If all of the states could converge to the best one, it's a reduction by 73%, but that may be a more demanding transformation. So those numbers were for disasters. I don't have the time to go into the details, but when we look at long-term climate change, we find very similar things. So here I'm showing, again, per quintile, the impact of climate change by 2050, looking at labor productivity on the top left. And poor people are more affected because they do physical work outside. And so the impact of temperature on labor productivity is bigger. On the top right, it's health through water and vector-borne disease. And again, we have more exposure of poor people, so they are losing more. And the last bottom left one is on agriculture, where the effect is a little bit more balanced, but there is still an effect through the share of the budget that people spend on food. So if climate change has an impact on food prices, of course, poor people spending more on food will be affected more. And so on the bottom right, you see if I sum those three channels, that again, you have a very clear signal that poor people are more affected, which for me, really strong illustration of the fact that poverty reduction is an adaptation intervention, and that you're building resilience by reducing poverty. So I'll just stop here. I think it's enough for the problem. We all want to talk about the solutions. I just want to say when we look at the key drivers, the key variables that will affect resilience, the things that really jump at us are things like the safety net system and its coverage. We discussed it today. The ability of households to save in a safe way. So if you save in form of livestock or in your house, it's not safe and it can be lost. If you save in a bank account, it tends to be safer. Early warning systems, asset vulnerability, quality of housing, income diversification, and of course, the fact that if you're self-employed, you have no diversification of the assets that will make a living. But what I wanted to close with, because it's a panel on inequality, is even if you control for all of the things, inequality itself is still a factor of non-resilience. So it's not only about providing people with all of the tools that they need. The fact that you have big inequalities is something that is reducing communities' resilience. And I'll stop on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very lucid, very clear, and sorry, I thought I'd shut this off. Thank you, Stephane, and we'll come back to more to you on the solutions, but one of the striking things was that the rich, because they have more assets, may, during certain kinds of disaster, actually lose more, and then the question is, are they able to recover that or recover more of it, depending on how the state responses, among other things. Right, thank you. So, Somanathan, Dr. Somanathan, may I invite you to let me introduce Professor Somanathan. He's a professor of economics and in the Economics and Planning Unit of the Indian Statistical Institute. He's also the founding head of the Center for Research on the Economics of Climate, Food, Research, and Environment at the Institute. His research lies at the intersection of environmental and development issues and political economy, and some of his recent work has been on air pollution, groundwater depletion, climate impacts, and carbon pricing. He's served on many committees, but I do want to mention that he was a coordinating lead author for the IPCC. And those of you of the students who think they need to submit in journals, he has a good one which he manages, Environmental and Development Economics.
Well, thank you. It's a tough act to follow, Stephane. I'm going to talk about something which is kind of much more micro. So I'm going to talk about one particular issue, which is the impact of heat stress and how that is unequally distributed among people. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to say anything about resilience because it's always harder to find answers than to point out problems. So all I'm going to do is point out problems, I'm afraid.
Is the sound okay?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so all I'm going to do, I'm afraid, is to point out problems. I don't have solutions, so I'm not actually going to be able to say much about resilience. But let me go ahead and just point out something about the inequality and with regard to one particular issue that is going to become more and more important as time passes, and that is heat stress. So at the national level, there have been some studies which look at GDP, right? And so this paper, for example, by Jen and others, find a decline in GDP growth of 2.5% per degree Celsius increase in temperature, using data over time from all Indian states from 1980 to 2015. This effect is larger than previous studies found looking across the whole world and looking at countries, and that illustrates this unequal impact of heat, because India is both poorer and hotter than most countries. Also, if you look within India, this study finds that the effect is larger in poorer states. So it's about 4.7% loss of GDP growth per degree increase in temperature. For the poorer states, it's 1.7% for the richer states, where here poorer and richer means the bottom half and the top half of states when they're ordered by GDP. The effects also unequal. So states with larger shares of agricultural output have greater damage from heat. And there's unfortunately no evidence in the data of adaptation. So basically the effects in the first half of the period are not larger than the effects in the second half of the period. And if they were smaller in the second half of the period, that might be some sign that the economy is adapting. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case. So there's a similar study using district level data, which was published more recently. And here it's a similar kind of finding. Overall, at the national level, it's about a 3.2% decline in GDP growth per degree Celsius increase in temperature. And again, the effect for poor districts is larger, significantly larger than the effect for richer districts. So poorer districts are hit harder by heat. Then moving down to sort of more micro level, we looked at, this is a study that I did with some co-authors, we looked at manufacturing output using data on manufacturing plants. And what we find is that output falls by about 2% per degree rise in temperature. And that's true, at the upper end of the temperature distribution, the decline is bigger. And these are for factory workers, by and large, right? It's manufacturing. But in India, as we know, most of the labor force is not in formal manufacturing. They're in the informal sector, and that informal sector accounts for more than 80% of the labor force. And this is true not only in India, but in low and lower middle income countries more generally. So this particular study, which is done with Somanathan Das of the Institute for Economic Growth, who's sitting over there, we did basically daily surveys. Every day we surveyed workers in 2 Delhi slums in the summer of 2019. And this graph just shows you what the temperature ranges were. The upper one is the maximum, and down below you have minimum temperature and something called wet bulb temperature, which is basically a measure that incorporates effects of humidity. And as you can see, there's a very heterogeneous and diverse group of occupations of people living in these slums, as you might expect. And here, what I want to show you here is basically that what this graph depicts is basically the effect of a degree increase in temperature. So from one day to the next, right, for the same worker, on their earnings, all right? And the one I would like you to focus on is the light blue ones, which are net earnings. And what you see is that if you increase wet bulb temperature by 1 degree, you get a 19% drop in net earnings, right, from day to day. This was for these workers in the summer of 2019. We surveyed about 400 workers. And there's similar effects. If you look at maximum temperature, the drop for net earnings is about 14%. If you look at minimum temperature, it's about 12%. If you look at the average, it's about 16%. So these are really huge drops. And I just want to remind you that I just showed you that the effect that we found for workers in the manufacture, for productivity or output in the manufacturing sector, was about 2% per degree in India, right? And here it's much, much, much larger. Of course, part of the reason for that is that this is looking only at the summer, and of course you would expect the effects to be much larger in the summer, right? So let me just go on. I'll come back to that issue about the comparison in a moment. So here we're looking at just the probability that workers go to work and how that changes per degree increase in temperature. And you can see that basically the probability that workers don't work increases by about 2% for 1 degree increase in wet bulb temperature. That's the red dot on the right. Right? And on average in the sample, workers didn't work for about 17% of the days. And of those did not work due to heat more than half of the time, right? So if you look at the light blue ones, right, what they're saying is that if temperature increases by 1 degree, wet bulb temperature, then the probability that you didn't go to work because it was too hot to work increases by about 8%, right? So basically what this study is doing is, what's different about this study from the other studies that came before is that we're not only looking at productivity effects, we're also looking at effects of whether people go to work at all. So basically, if you have a loss of earnings, it can be because you were unable to work, or because you worked, but you were able to work less effectively. Right, so both of these are incorporated here. And just to summarize, there were 2 heat waves that occurred during the study month in 2019, which were added up to about 10 days out of 1 month. And net earnings were on average 40% lower on heat wave days, it should say, on heat wave days than on other days. Okay, so really, it's really very, very big impacts. So let me just do some comparison with previous studies of informal sector workers. There are not many of those. In fact, there are only 2 that we could find in lower income or low middle income countries, both in India, which looked at informal sector workers. So there's one study from 2013, and they looked at rice harvesters in eastern India, and they found that productivity declined by about 5% per degree increase in wet bulb temperature at a range of temperatures similar to those in the study. So they were also doing their study in the summer. So you can see here that the effect compared to what we found on earnings, which was for wet bulb temperature, more than 18%, is much smaller, right? Part of the reason is probably that here they were picking up only on-the-job effects and not the fact that people couldn't go to work. There's another one which was done, again, about 10 years ago, and this was on people working in brick kilns. And here they did some measurements on physiological parameters, but they also looked at income, and the income loss was about 2%, essentially because people were being paid piece rates, and they were, when it was hotter, they were able to work less effectively. So they ended up with lower earnings. Again, this study doesn't pick up this effect, which is coming from the fact that people may not be able to go to work at all. Okay, so just, you might think that, well, these studies were all done in somewhat extreme conditions if one takes a global perspective, because northern India in summer is very hot, right, in a global perspective. But actually, there are a lot of people who, in the informal sector, who are exposed to that kind of temperatures. We mapped global temperatures in the hottest months of the year worldwide, and we find that 320 million informal sector workers worldwide are exposed to average temperatures which are similar to those in the temperature range of this study for at least 1 month of the year. Okay, so let me just turn to how people can adapt to this. Well, the most obvious thing is, of course, that adaptation is limited by low incomes. So you notice that in our study, minimum temperature also had an effect, also that minimum temperature is observed at night and people are working during the day. But of course, the point is if it's hot at night, then you don't rest as well, you don't sleep as well, which we also looked at in the study, but I didn't want to go into those details. And so one way that you could adapt is by having cooler homes, right? So at least when you're resting at night, you're better off. But if you, as you look in this graph, with richer countries on the left, Japan, US, Korea, Saudi Arabia, etc., this is basically percentage of households with an AC. And then when you come to poorer countries on the right, India at the extreme right, you'll see that, of course, very few people have ACs. And that's just a function of incomes, right? Even though India is a hot country, hotter than many of the other countries in the data. So I'll just say a few things, which is sort of kind of thinking aloud, and I hope that, you know, all of you will contribute here. So what can be done? Well, sort of the obvious thing is that if we can have rapid and inclusive growth so that incomes of people at the most vulnerable people can rise, then that'll be, in some sense, the best adaptation strategy, because as we see, it's the very fact that you're poor that makes you more vulnerable. Then immediately we could think about assistance for housing improvements to make homes more heat resistant, and you know, there are experiments with cooled roofs and so on that people have been doing. We could have some limited amount of regulation. I say limited because you don't want counterproductive regulation, which will sort of deprive people from work because the regulations have become more strict. So some a degree of regulation to make sure that workplaces are, you know, better provided with facilities which allow people to adapt to the heat. And I think most importantly, better social insurance more generally, which is something that we in any case need, but we are going to need in particular in summers in India as time passes even more. Okay, so I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. So that's a pretty alarming picture, and I've always found it interesting that we've talked a lot over the years about the impact of heat and temperature rise on agriculture in the context of drought and heat stress for crops. But here what we are seeing is that actually our manufacturing sector and our informal self-employed sector is not protected. And I, when this research first came out, is really struck by the numbers in terms of fall in productivity, even for the industrial workers, and now for informal sector workers. So I think this is all cutting edge work, and there's huge issues for policy here. So with those words, thank you, Professor Somanathan, and may I invite Dr. Radhika Khosla. Radhika has just arrived yesterday from Oxford, but as you know, she seems very fresh. Radhika is an associate professor at the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment and research director of the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development at the University of Oxford. And she is the program lead of Zero Carbon Energy Use at Oxford Zero Institute. She's also running a multi-country program on the future of cooling, which seems to a natural follow-up on Professor Somanathan's presentation. And coming to journals, she's editor-in-chief of Environmental Research Letters. So again, somebody who's, in case I see all the students here smiling, it's another place where you might consider publishing.
Thank you, Bina, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's wonderful. I'm going to follow up on some of the themes that Som raised and talk about heat and also the implication of heat, which is naturally in the demand for cooling and the energy that it takes. But before I begin, I just, would like to start with this bigger picture version of the world we're in right now. And this image from the IPCC I find quite compelling because it tells us that no matter where we are, whether, you're born in 1950, in 1980, you have children born in 2020 or whatever it might be, the Earth looks very different from now moving forward to what it did many decades ago and even in the recent past. So we know that we're at a moment now where it's very likely that we're going to hit that 1.5 degrees of warming above the pre-industrial world by some measure even next year, and very likely in the next 5 years or by 2030. So even in the best case scenario, which is that sort of very low bar at the bottom, we are looking at significantly warmer temperatures globally, and the implication of that is that we're also going to have significantly warmer measures at the local level, particularly because of what global warming and climate change means for extreme heat. Now, actually, before I go there, I do want to say one thing about heat, which is particularly salient, and for me, it was stark when I learned this, that extreme heat kills more than any other extreme weather event. So as climate change rises, it's not droughts, it's not floods, it's not wildfires. Extreme heat kills more than any other. Also, at the same time, extreme heat is silent, right? You don't have the before and after images in the way that you have with destruction of other kinds. And so it's been a blind spot in our debates for a very, very long period of time. And we have some work that we did, which I won't talk about here, but I'll measure it. I'll just mention it in passing, which is that when we looked at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, it's 17 different SDGs and 169 targets. The word heat, cool, thermal, refrigeration does not appear once, right? So it's just something that's been ignored, and we've not had a chance to think about it in terms of both sustainability, resilience, or inequality. Now, let's just look at what that actually means as the world gets warmer. So we have on the graph here on the left a forecast of what world energy demand is going to look like by the end of this century. And again, this is, it's salient because in energy debates, traditionally, we've always thought of heating as being the largest source of global energy demand. And the literature and the discourse, predominantly because it comes out of Western climates, has been one which is focused on how are we going to manage heating. But if you look here, what we see is actually that by the end of the century, the demand just from air conditioning is going to be so much larger than that from global heating. Now, air conditioning is, it's an interesting beast. I like the quote by Lee Kuan Yew when he was asked what made Singapore what it is. Actually, I think they also asked him what made democracy possible, or some form of democracy possible in Singapore. And he could have said anything, but the response he gave was air conditioning, right? And he said air conditioning changed the nature of civilization by making development possible in the tropics. And I think that's true if we look across so many parts of the world, the Middle East, the south of the US, the tropics, so many parts of of hot climates. It is air conditioning that has made that possible and life habitable in these regions. So at the moment, we're at a place where global cooling takes about 20% of total electricity use. So already this is not a small amount, right? 20% of global electricity use is going to cooling. But how is that going to change? How is that going to change as the world gets warmer, as places urbanize, as income levels rise? The IEA says that 10 new air conditioners are going to be added every second for the next 30 years. So 10 new air conditioners every second for the next 30 years, that's the global increase in air conditioning. And the cooling energy that it's going to demand is equivalent of that by 2050, is equivalent of that of the United States, Europe, and Japan today. So that's the magnitude of energy demand coming onto the grid. And it raises huge questions about how we're going to meet that demand, the inequalities that arise from it. And what we already know actually is that in spite of that exponential growth in air conditioning, and even if you look at this graph here, you can see that at this S-shaped graph, we're at the beginning of this S-curve, right? We've hardly hit any air conditioning demand globally compared to what's coming. But even when we get to 2050 and air conditioning use rises, the estimate is that 2 to 5 billion people will not have access to an air conditioner when they are exposed to heat stress. Right? So you have a huge growth in the ability to cool, and you have a huge growth in the inability to access that one approach to providing yourself relief from heat stress. And as Som showed us, almost all the air conditioners today are in the US and in China, but that is going to change, and countries like India and Indonesia is where we see a lot of that growth. So we've been following a similar model to what Stephane talked about, which is to say, how do we understand the hazard, how do we understand exposure, and how do we understand vulnerability? So we did this work here where we said, as the world moves from 1.5 degrees of warming to 2 degrees of warming, where are we going to see the largest changes? And we used a measure called cooling degree days, which is an indicator of how much cooling demand will be needed as a response to how heat rises. So there are two graphs here. On the left-hand side, we said, where is the largest absolute change in cooling degree days going to come from when we go from a 1.5 degree world to a 2 degree world? And you can see that the largest changes, at least the top 10 countries that are going to have the highest increase, are all in Africa, and India is also very prominent there. We then said, well, what about relative change, right? And relative change is important because it tells us something about the ability to adapt given where we are right now. And when we looked at relative change, actually the top 10 countries that are going to be most affected are in Europe. And when we did this work, it was, it kind of like woke up a lot of people in climates that are not traditionally hot, because it also suggests that this is not an issue that is only for hot countries or only for the tropics. This is an issue for every country. And actually, in Switzerland, there's a case going on called the Climate Grannies case, which is 4 elderly women who started this legal case, and now there's a big following, and they are fighting against the Swiss government, saying that the Swiss government is not doing enough to manage extreme heat, and this is affecting the elderly, the health of the elderly, and they won that case. So it's actually it's a nice story in climate litigation to also suggest that, look, this is what the hazard is looking like across the world. We then want to look at vulnerability, right? Which is to say that was extreme, the heat that's coming and the cooling demand that's coming up. But what does that mean for the populations that are exposed in countries around the world? And so we looked at a 1 kilometer square globally at the populations that will be exposed to, say, 1.5 degrees in 2030, right? Which is not that far away. And what's the country that comes up as number 1, right? So India comes up as the country that has the largest population exposure to that world, where we'll see 1.5 degrees of warming at 2030. And we looked at this at a 1 kilometer grid scale, so we can go deeper, and I'll just show you that graph right now to see what does that inequality within the country look like. We also then wanted to understand, there was the hazard, there's the exposure, but also vulnerability. And the way we're able to do that at the moment, always imperfect measures, but even so, is to look at GDP at a 1 kilometer square as well. So here we're combining the cooling degree days, the population exposure, and the GDP at a 1 kilometer square. And you can see that the regions that are the darkest spots, in this case, there are many in India, but actually in the African region, they're the largest. And it tells you what is the ability of the population to be able to adapt, where, if we think of resilience and one measure of resilience as economic resilience and economic capability, what is that going to look like regionally, and what are the inequalities spatially that exist globally as we try and tackle this problem? We then said, okay, you have hazard, you have exposure, you have vulnerability, but one of the primary ways to tackle heat is air conditioning, right? And air conditioning is reliant on electricity price. So if we then combine the heat adaptive capacity, which is everything I talked about on the y-axis, and the x-axis, we talk about electricity price, and we map, most countries of the world on this, and the population size is the size of the bubble, what countries are most exposed? And the red box here is the one that has the countries that have highest electricity price globally, but also have the highest, the lowest ability to respond based on their heat capacity index. And once again, India comes up as a country which is going to be most vulnerable, both in terms of the relationship with the heat adaptive capacity and with electricity price. So honestly, these graphs are, this is all work in progress where, it's under review at a journal right now, but all of this suggests that this is not looking good for where we are here, and it suggests that we really need to think about how is this going to unfold at scale and at different levels of governance, right? Whether it's the building level, the people level, the urban level, or the national level. So this tells you a little bit about what the spatial inequalities within the country are going to look like. Here we've zoomed in on that 1 kilometer resolution that we have. And you can see that certain parts of the country are just, are going to look much worse than others. But essentially, we have everything looking pretty bad in terms of the ability of populations to be able to respond economically as heat rises, and particularly in terms of the exposure that we're going to have. And the literature tells us quite clearly that low-income populations that live in deprived urban zones already suffer more from overheating, and existing vulnerabilities and existing cleavages in the system get worse as we have new forms of climate impacts, and particularly as extreme heat comes on as a new form of climate impact, and that results to higher mortality, higher energy costs, and higher discomfort. We are also doing some work where we're looking nationally at what the regional differences are in the response, which is often air conditioning, like I was saying. So overall, we're at a place right now where the penetration of air conditioners is at about 5%, but it's not even 5% nationally. So it's extremely low. The urban, within the country has a higher rate of about 12.5 or 12.6 or say 13%, which again is low, but as I was saying, it's moving very, very fast. We're seeing that rate, double often in cities. The regions which have the highest share of AC ownership are, not surprisingly wealthier places. So Punjab, Chandigarh, Haryana, Delhi, Gujarat, Goa, Kerala, Pondicherry, these, approximately 10% of the population here already owns air conditioning. And then when we look at regions with the lowest share of AC ownership, again, it's not very surprising. And a lot of it is based in the Northeast, which in some sense is a function of climate as well. When we look at deciles across the country, about 20% of the top income level own air conditioners. And again, this just, we see this number and we understand this number to be rising very, very quickly as we look at models of growth. One thing to say about air conditioning is when, we did a survey where we looked only at the Delhi sample in 2019, and there we found that actually it's not just the fact that, homes have air conditioning, but also the kind of air conditioning that homes have at the moment are highly inefficient. And I say that with a pinch of salt. Okay, there are there's 3-star, but which is basically to say it's a very average air conditioner. The highest end of air conditioning or efficiency, which is a 5-star AC, is often not what people are buying, right? So what is in the system and what is being put in the system, what will stay in the system, what will be sold secondhand, all of that is also not at the highest level of energy efficiency, which then introduces different kinds of inequalities in itself. So just to end, you asked us about solutions and suggestions. So this is some work that we had done for the United Nations Global Cooling Spotlight Report. It's the first time the United Nations did a report on cooling. I was the lead author of it. And our goal was to say, how do we get to a world where we're going to need cooling, right? And we can't say that, people should not have cooling. So there's going to be extreme heat, and we want everyone to be able to have thermal comfort, right? And everyone to be able to have access. So what we ideally want is a world in 2050 where you have enough cooling for everyone, but it's zero emissions cooling, right? Which is to say, to be able to provide cooling, but without the impact on the environment that is detrimental. So we created this chart based on, a lot of detailed modeling, and this was the basis of the Global Cooling Pledge, which 70 countries have now signed. The thing to focus on here is that, that bar that shows 6.1 billion tons, basically without any new action on responding to cooling or cooling energy demand, we're in a world where we're going to have about 6.1 billion tons of carbon dioxide coming just from our response to heat. Now, how do we bring that 6.1 billion tons down to zero? And the good news is that it is possible to do that, right? So there are three things that can be really, really helpful and can deliver 60% of the emissions reduction. Those three things are investment in passive cooling approaches, investment in high efficiency technologies for air conditioner, and a rapid phase down of refrigerant gases that is ahead of the time schedule of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. So that will bring us to about 2.3 billion tons of annual emissions. Now, to me, what is the gift of cooling in some sense, and possibly even the gift of extreme heat, is that cooling is electricity based, right? So unlike heating, which is often reliant on gas, cooling is actually comes from, if we go with an air conditioner, it's based on the electricity grid, and the grid can be cleaned, right? So that last 2.3%, if we are able to decarbonize the grid, we can then lead to a world where we actually have almost zero emissions cooling by 2050, which allows us to respond to extreme heat and be able to build that resilience and adaptive capability that we've been talking about. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. When I joined the Institute of Economic Growth in the early 80s, there was no ACs in the offices. In fact, there weren't even coolers. And when they started introducing coolers, there was a clear hierarchy. So the professors got the coolers. These are the coolers we know. You have a cuss, the grass, and the exhaust fan pulls the air through that, and it cools you at least when it's not too humid. And then finally, of course, it came down to associate professors and assistant professors. Now, I have to think back whether I was more or less productive and how many papers I produced then as today, where we all have ACs. But it does raise questions about alternative methods of cooling, which when we were growing up, we had these exhaust coolers, and even now you have many of them. So that will be something we could come back to. And it also reminds me that we can cool ourselves, but what about our food? So there is the whole issue of refrigeration in tropical climates where food gets bad. So you've provided us some answers, but there's much to be discussed in the second round. So thank you very much. That was very illuminating and alarming. And of course, ACs also indicate that there is inequality, who can afford them and who cannot. So with this, may I request Professor Ashwini Deshpande to speak to us. Professor Deshpande is professor and head of the Department of Economics and academic director, Center for Economic Data and Analysis at the Ashoka University. And prior to that, she was with the Delhi School of Economics. So we've known each other for a long period of time. She's particularly known for her work on inequality relating to caste, and then subsequently also on gender. And so there's a range of books which I won't even go into. Just want to mention that in 2007, you got the V.K. R.B. Rao Award for Indian Economists Under 45. And I think Dr. Ghate, Professor Ghate, you did too, didn't you? No? Not the V.K. R.B. Rao, but there was another one. And the Scotch Award for Gender Economics in 2022. So, Ashwini.
Thank you, Bina. I'm an outlier in this panel. It's not going to be about climate and ACs and typhoons. But anyhow, thank you, IG, for inviting me today. I'm just going to present a few results from my research, but also just some few facts for us to ponder about, and as requested by Bina. So in the COVID-19 pandemic, when the first lockdown happened, there was a lot of discussion, globally, about who suffered more as a result of the economic activity stopping. Was it men or women? And globally, what you find is that women suffered greater job losses as a result of the first wave of lockdowns compared to men, because the sectors that were most affected by the closures and by the need for social distancing, such as hospitality or beauty or healthcare or even home services, were sectors where women were disproportionately more active than men. However, in India, we already had pre-existing inequalities such that women's labor force participation rate, particularly their involvement in paid activities, has been lower than men much before the pandemic. And so when actually the pandemic hit, when economic activity ceased for all practical purposes, the absolute number of job losses for men were actually higher, despite the fact that it was again similar sectors that were more affected than others. So for example, if you look at urban activity that more or less completely ceased to operate, but it was men who lost jobs more, because men were more in the labor force compared to women. But this paper that I have, and there's lots of figures, I'm not going to go into all of those, but what I found in this study was that conditional on having been in the labor force before the pandemic, the decline of both incomes as well as labor force participation rates for women was higher. So if you condition on the fact that women who were already in the labor force, then they suffered more compared to men. But in an absolute sense, India is an exception in that men suffered more compared to women. And of course, there are important state level differences here. There are important caste differences within this. So India has a complex social fabric, and nothing is just as simple as a binary between men and women. And rural, urban, again, there are differences where the shocks were much greater in urban areas compared to rural, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that you see that big yawning gap between the male and female labor force participation rates, and there was a discussion early on about what resilience means. Is it what is it, doing it better? What was the phrase? Building back better, or is it going back to business as usual? So I'm afraid that it's we've gone back to business as usual, which I'll show you some figures. So there was a hope that the pandemic will teach us some lessons, and we'll be more aware of the gender gaps, and so that we'll build back better. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Also, in this paper, I looked at the time spent on domestic chores by men and women, because in India, the responsibility for domestic chores is disproportionately lies with the women compared to men. So either women have to do it themselves or they have to get it done, but regardless, it's their job to get it done. And this ratio of time spent on domestic chores in India is amongst the highest in the world. So women spend as much as 10 times more hours on domestic chores relative to men. And when the first lockdown happened in India, because domestic helpers had stopped coming, you actually saw a decline in that gap during the first lockdown. And so there were lots of commentaries about, is this the green shoots of gender equality being sown, and is it the case that now men will realize there's all this work to be done in the household, and when we actually gradually open up and business starts as usual, maybe men will realize that we hadn't been actually contributing as much, and we should go back to doing that. Unfortunately, not only have we gone back to business as usual, actually from this data set, you see that the gender gap has increased. So women do more than they were doing before the pandemic, and men do less. So it's almost with a vengeance that you made us you made us contribute to domestic chores during the first wave, and that we now have to just go back and say, enough, we've done that, been there, done that, and we can't do it anymore. So all those proud pictures of the men waving their jhadus and that you saw in the social medias, unfortunately, that turned out to be not quite the green shoot that we were looking at. So if you define resilience or rebounding or building better, unfortunately, the lessons that we learned from the first wave did not translate into changing things substantially. So that's the first wave of the pandemic. I also looked at what happened to different caste groups. And here, of course, the data is administrative data. So these are large caste groups, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and OBCs relative to the upper caste. And, again, we look at the likelihood of being employed during the lockdown, We also look at wages and incomes, etc. And we find that likelihood of being employed during the lockdown, this is the first lockdown again. The second lockdown is a little bit harder because it was more diffuse. There was much more resurgence of economic activity during the second wave compared to the first wave. But the first wave the lockdown was absolute and brutal. And so the likelihood of being employed during the lockdown period for the upper caste, which is the non-SC, ST, OBC groups, was twice that of the SC, STs and 1.7 times that of the OBCs. So groups that were already better off were in some sense more resilient, if I may use the term that way, in terms of withstanding the shock of the first economic lockdown. Now, of course, you could say that, well, the upper castes are also economically better off. So what you're measuring is not really the effect of caste per se, but it's really class differences that are showing out. And so we actually look at some indicators of class status. So we look at, for example, those with access to white-collar jobs, or we look at those with education more than 12 years. And in fact, you find that if you look at people who are in white-collar jobs, you don't see a gap between OBCs and upper castes. So yes, class does become a protective feature for the intermediate group, which is OBCs. But it is not so much a protective feature for SC/STs. So amongst white-collar workers, the gaps in the likelihood of being employed between upper castes and SC/STs are lower, but they are not insignificant. So there's still, they don't vanish. So class is not as much of a protective factor for the lowest ranked groups that are the lowest ranked castes and tribal groups in the country. Again, we looked at, we just separated people into two categories of education, those with more than 12 years and those with less than 12 years, because of, if you have 12 years of education, you're likely to get a government job, etc., etc. Your likelihood of getting a better quality job improves. So we found that, again, education is a bit of a protective factor in that those with more than 12 years of education, the caste gaps are smaller, but they are not insignificant and they don't vanish. In individuals with less than 12 years of education, caste gaps are higher. So yes, access to white-collar jobs or having education is a bit of a protective factor, but it does not diminish the gaps between social groups. So this suggests to us, and there's more in the paper and also in a lot of my other work, not in this particular paper, which suggests that what we are really looking at is the effect of social identity and not just effect of economic class background. Shocks can be of many types. So if you look at, for example, the sudden withdrawal of 86% of our currency that happened in 2016, you find, given that a large part of India's workforce, 90%, is in the informal sector, you see a sudden decline in labor force participation rate, particularly in rural areas, but also in urban areas, because those informal workers that work in enterprises that deal with cash suddenly saw their economic activity being affected. But even this shock, which was, which hit all the informal workers hard, women were 2 percentage points less likely to be in the labor force compared to men. So even an economic shock such as this, this move by the government hit women worse than it hit men. And again, we can look at social group differences here, and you find a similar picture. So whether it is health shocks or whether it is economic shocks, you see the impact on individuals varies depending on their social identity. So women are disproportionately hit worse than men, and within men and within women, the lower ranked groups are disproportionately hit. Now, there is a lot of discussion on labor force participation rate, and I'm not saying that labor force participation rate is the only indicator of well-being, but that it's one of the indicators. And in the last about 5 years or so, you've seen a steady increase in female labor force participation rate, about which I've written elsewhere. Part of it is just better measurement of women's unpaid work and self-employment. And while we should note the fact that there's been an increase in female labor force participation rate, however, despite the increase, the gap in male and female participation rates is significant and continues to be significant, and it's much more than other countries at comparable levels of GDP. So the India male-female labor force participation gap is higher compared to other countries at a comparable level of GDP. And so while we must acknowledge the fact that labor FLFP is increasing, has been increasing over the last few years, but the gaps still remain pretty substantial. And if you look at the gaps, if you look at the male-female differences in sectoral composition of where they are employed, again you see a difference here, which is that men's participation in agriculture has been going down. I have figures here only for 3 years, but I have all the figures in other papers, but I've shown in this graph it's only for 3 years. So you have about 32% or so men in agriculture now. By agriculture, I mean primary activities, forestry, fishing, etc. But women still continue to be predominantly employed in agriculture. And incidentally, the increase in female labor force participation rate post-COVID also coincides with an increase in the share of agriculture in total employment. And female labor force participation rate is very closely correlated with the share of agriculture in total employment. So when share of agriculture in total employment is high, female labor force participation rate is high, and it's not difficult to see why. When share of agriculture in total employment declines, female labor force participation rate also declines. So there is a question of thinking of paid work opportunities for women outside the agricultural sector, and that remains a challenge even today. And so in rural areas, basically, women can either work in agriculture or allied activities or construction. A few are in banks or schools, etc. But by and large, there are very few non-farm paid employment opportunities available in rural India, both for men and women, but it's particularly the case for women. Yes, so this is the distribution of female workforce among various sectors, which is rural and urban. So this earlier was a comparison of men and women. This is just female workforce, rural and urban. And in fact, you see, for example, rural women, 73% of rural women are involved in primary activities, agriculture and allied, etc. So when we think of increasing female labor force participation rates, it can't only be, we cannot only be thinking of agriculture, and we really need to think of productive opportunities that engage the productive capacities of Indian women. Because the one graph that I don't have here is a graph that shows a declining gap in male and female education levels. So female education has expanded rapidly over the last 2 decades, such that male-female education gaps are now become more or less insignificant. So women are more educated, as a result of which their aspirations are greater. They want to work in jobs other than agriculture, but the reality of the labor market is such that bulk of their, in the rural areas, they are in agriculture. In urban areas, they are in services, but again, there are male-female gaps in terms of which kind of services men do versus women. Finally, and this is my last slide, and so this is really now rural, urban, male, female, SC, ST, OBC. So it's all of these things put together, and lots of numbers here. What I really want to just tell you from this table is that basically we are back to business as usual. So if you compare this table with the table, say, about 10 years ago, it looks very similar. The only thing that's is changed is a slightly higher rate of female labor force participation rate compared to the period between 2004-05 and 17-18, which is when it was declining. But if you look at the pre-4-5 period, you find similar rates here, really. So what it suggests is that the COVID pandemic or demonetization or any of these shocks, while they hit women adversely and hit marginalized groups more adversely, somehow we didn't use that to build better, and we've really gone back to our earlier gaps. What are the solutions? I really don't know much, other than, I can't say concretely what the solutions are, but what I'll say is that unless women and marginalized groups have a seat at the table in terms of decision making, and I'm talking about decision making at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level, policies will always be such that their priorities or their special problems are not going to get reflected adequately. And so I would think that decision making, involvement in decision making would be the one big change that public decision making, both in the private and the public sector. By public, I mean
not inside the home alone.
No. It's inside the home also, but that's harder to achieve. But I think that, women's decision-making ability inside the home starts to change gradually as their economic empowerment increases. So as long as they're not in paid jobs, it's unlikely that inside the home there's going to be much change in their position, in their decision-making and say. So I think we really have to look at the economic sphere and think of how we change this picture of the labor market which we see from this table. Thank you very much.
Thank you for presenting a topic which has been long debated, continues to be debated. Everybody, including the World Bank, is very concerned about India's low labor force participation rate in particular. So I just want to share that, Ashwini and I, we're both part of a small group it's called the Feminist Economics Saturday Discussion Group, meets once a month for 12 years. And one of the debates that we have, because labor force participation is the most debated topic. Why is it decreasing? What is the data? And Ashwini is, of course, one of the top experts on this. The point of debate is, however, that what about assets? So do we see women purely as labor, or do we also see them as entrepreneurs, as farmers, not just as farm wives? And I feel unless we begin to talk about assets, land for women who work on farms, business and other assets for women who are self-employed in other sectors, we might be only seeing one side of the picture. And I want to emphasize that we have a number of policymakers here, that labor force participation is about jobs. But beyond jobs, if they're self-employed, and 90% are in the informal sector, large proportion, 75% of women are in agriculture, but only 14% or less of households have women owning land. So I think there's a big gap. I think Ashwini will agree with that, unless the government also begins to talk about providing assets for women and not just talk about bringing them into the labor market, we might be only partially moving forward. So here we have a wide range of 4 very amazing and excellent presentations. We've looked at economic shocks and its inequality, a range of shocks actually Stephane talked about, looked at heat waves and heat shocks, and of course the rising temperatures, which are the quiet, even if you don't have heat waves, the issue of inequality in cooling access, and then COVID as an example of health shocks to see much more granularly, where we don't tend to look within households, which is gender, and we don't see cross differences between households, which is on caste and SC, ST, and other aspects of social inequality. So may I invite the panelists now? We'll talk. You won't necessarily need to use slides, and pose the second brief question to you. You've already talked about potential solutions to the problems you talked about, but here's, beyond the slides, any thoughts that you may have, 3 or 4 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for responses from the floor, and if you had questions to each other. So Stephane, did you want to elaborate? You did have a slide on it, but I think we'd like to hear more.
Well, I can try, but of course it won't be possible to cover it all. But I think the way we're trying to look at the resilience challenge is by making it completely part of the development challenge, and say we can't really separate what is resilience and what is development. As soon as you acknowledge the fact that people living in extreme poverty will always be living in extreme vulnerability, poverty reduction, development, income growth becomes part of the package of things you have to do for resilience. And when we look at the type of projects that we're supporting on the ground, it's sometimes really, really hard to decide if it's development, adaptation, and resilience, maybe 50-50, maybe 20-80. All of those things are very mixed. But what we see in the data is that increasing incomes and reducing poverty is really building resilience. What we see in the data also is that not all economic growth is providing resilience. And just to give you maybe a couple of examples, we keep in the world building cities more in flood zones than in safe areas. So we're through economic growth, because urbanization is a good thing, right? We're actively building the risks of tomorrow that will be extremely costly to reverse. So protecting a city is very expensive. Resettling people is even more complicated and expensive. And still, we know where those flood zones are, but we keep building on them. So you can get the same economic growth by driving your urbanization in safe places. You don't have to sacrifice your GDP growth, but with the same GDP growth, you can get, of course, much better resilience. Similarly, we're building, and countries like India in this extremely rapid buildup of infrastructure. These infrastructure systems really needs to be resilient to the risks of tomorrow. In many places in the world, we don't have the construction standards that take into account future risks. And so we're building things that are supposed to last for like 50 or 80 years. They will have to be retrofitted, and it would be, of course, much cheaper to just design for the right risks just right away. So again, yes, economic growth is really important, but not any economic growth. And of course, this panel is on inequality, so there is another dimension which is really essential. It's the inclusiveness of that growth. And to me, one thing that's really important is, I don't know what your experience is, but when I talk about climate impacts or disaster impacts, everything people want to know is the GDP impact. And it's extremely frustrating because you can have the same GDP growth in an inclusive way that brings all of the population together. If you have like 20%, the bottom 20% stagnating, it won't change much to your GDP growth, right? Because people tend to be very poor in the bottom 20%. So what you say on GDP doesn't really inform you on what's happening for the very poor, who are also the most vulnerable. And so same thing, like the same GDP growth can get you much more resilience if it's inclusive and it brings along the lowest income categories. And it's lowest income, but it's also excluded communities or like very remote communities that are not connected to markets and don't benefit from the macro level growth. So the social protection system, but also the delivery of education and healthcare to the people at the lower income or more remote places is, again, a way of making growth better at delivering resilience. And just to conclude, I think we still have some things that more growth and better growth will not do. Adapting to sea level rise on the coasts, adapting to temperature rise, as we discussed quite a lot in this panel, that requires some very targeted interventions. And those interventions cut across all of the sectors, right? So we have talked a lot about AC. If you rely only on AC and you don't improve your buildings and your cities and you don't get more water and greeneries in your cities, what you get is that the peak electricity demand will be so large at the maximum temperature time of the day that the cost of your electricity system will go through the roof. So you really have to just use all of the tools together. And I think how you build buildings is really, really critical. And that's important here because you're building a lot of buildings. And so having them, even if you cannot have air conditioning in them now, having them efficient enough so that when you bring air conditioning in them, it's not too inefficient and too expensive is absolutely critical. And that requires early action. So I would just mention that too.
Thank you. So.
Well, I don't want to take up more mic time. I think that I'd like to hear from other people. I'll just add one small thing from what I said, which was that which I didn't actually mention, that we did also, there's one other study of looking at people at the same range of temperatures that we had in this, our study in the summer of, in Delhi summer. And that was in Hong Kong. It was construction workers in Hong Kong. And they were also studied at a time when the temperatures, wet bulb temperatures, were similar to what we saw in Delhi. And they did have productivity losses, and those were kind of between 3 and 4% per degree. So again, much smaller than what we saw in our study. And it's kind of, those were productivity losses. In our study, it was income losses. So of course, we're taking into account the fact that people didn't go to work. So that's part of it. It's probably also that people are generally in better health. They had better protection on the job, even if it's outdoor construction where you can, there's limited amount that you can do. So I think there is really this very stark inequality. So pre-existing inequalities mean that you're much more vulnerable if you at the bottom of the distribution.
Thank you. Yeah, Radhika, and particularly other non-AC forms of cooling, is that an option as well? Why are we only talking about ACs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did want to say, but I was conscious of time at the moment, that I think the air conditioner having become the go-to solution for heat is, it's just terrible, because that's not. It doesn't have to be that way, but we've been acclimatized socially and otherwise to have that become the go-to solution. And there's a very interesting cultural history to that problem. But yeah, so in terms of solutions, there were three things that I talked about, one of which was passive cooling approaches, and that draws on such a deep tradition that we have in many countries on, how do we provide cooling that's not mechanical? How do we provide a relief from heat that is not based on the air conditioner? And that goes into architecture, into certain sort of forms of clothing, into behaviors, into policy approaches. So just I'd like to break that down a little bit. So there is, the whole range of passive cooling approaches which really rely on the built environment and what we're able to do with the built environment. Unfortunately, the built environment in many parts of the world has been quite a failed policy space in terms of how effective we can be using building energy codes. But that remains a really key area for us to be able to crack this problem of heat. I talked about energy efficiency of the appliances and also refrigerants, and those are all the technical solutions, right, to how we can try and solve this issue. But I do want to say that, cooling and heat and just more broadly, this area is a socio-technical world. It isn't just one that we can solve only by technology. And there are a number of different approaches, whether they are behavioral. Behavioral is also interesting, and this is a combination of behavioral and policy. But in Japan, there was a Cool Biz program a while ago now, where they basically said that you don't have to wear really sort of three-piece suits to office anymore, and you can lower the set point temperature, and that itself made a huge dent in the electricity consumption of the country, right? So using behavioral approaches, using technology approaches, using governance approaches, also using business approaches. There's a whole sort of movement now towards servitization as a model, and the use of sort of not actually owning an equipment, but actually being interested in the service that the appliance produces. And that servitization model as business approaches is another interesting way in which we're seeing these kinds of resilience approaches being built. And then finally, I'd say, I always think of infrastructure as a lever of change. And I think that's so powerful in places that are being built and developing very, very quickly. And, like Stephane was saying, for us here, it's such a key component, because once you lock in certain forms of the urban built environment, it's very, very hard to go and undo that and to do that differently. And you're basically locking carbon in for decades to come when you make a decision about how to build buildings, how to plan your urban space. And those become the longest living components of any economy. So actually, the decisions that are made around building and urban growth and planning are actually decisions that we make about locking in carbon, and subsequently they become decisions about locking in behaviors and institutions. Like, we could be in this room and be really environmentally conscious, and it could be a really hot day, and I'd want to open a window, but you know what? There's no window I can open, right? So actually, your infrastructure shapes your behaviors. And so I always think of infrastructure as a really powerful lever of change, and also as a solution that we have to think very carefully about.
Right. So I just want to ask you a slight footnote, that we always think of ACs as individualistic. I'm sitting in my 4-bedroom apartment and I'm air conditioned, and a lot of people who are doing that are is it possible to think of a way by which we say, we are going to provide you cooling in this hall, and you can spend a few hours there, and have some regulation that individually sees beyond this point would not be allowed. I mean, some way by which we regulate, or at least provide it to people who can't afford the cooling, and you provide, like we do, you provide shelters. But if you're poor, you go to a shelter. Perhaps there are more cooperative methods by which it'll mean a change in lifestyles, of course. Ashwini, yours is the most complex. Also, if you wanted to say something about, the nature of work which is increasing for women, like the domestic workers was very much of a touch kind of work. So during COVID, people didn't want male domestic workers to come into the home because it's certain kind of work which they wanted to separate themselves from the person. Whatever it is, I know it's a really complex issue.
Yeah, so I think one, instead of a solution, let me actually point out a problem that I didn't refer to, which is the backdrop to this entire issue of labor force participation, which is that in India, particularly from the late 1980s, the gap between the additions to the working age population and the opportunities for productive work, basically the supply of labor and the demand for labor. So basically there's a mismatch between, and a growing mismatch between the number of jobs available for people to work in and the supply of people who... All, farm and non-farm, more acute for non-farm. But overall, there's a gap between the supply of individuals in the productive age group and the number of productive opportunities available to them. So when we focus on the female labor force participation and the gap between male and female, we also have to keep in mind the overall context of just lack of productive opportunities for everybody, both men and women. And I think that's the backdrop within which you can then look at disparities between male, female, or caste groups, etc. As it happens, Dalit and Adivasi women have higher labor force participation rates compared to upper caste women, both because of economic necessity as well as some cultural norms which are sometimes prevent upper caste women from being in paid labor force, or at least even if they are, they often don't admit that to a survey. So that's one larger backdrop that I want to keep in mind. The second just clarificatory point is that labor force participation rates include self-employment as well. It's not just wage and salaried jobs. So agriculture, self-employment, basically if you're economically active, so either you're economically active and employed, either self-employed or in wage employment, or looking for work, all of those individuals would be counted as a part of the labor force. And the larger question of is labor force participation rate the only or the most crucial indicator of well-being? Certainly it isn't, but it's a very important indicator of well-being. So while we must also talk about wage rates, types of jobs, contracts. If you look at, number of people who work with jobs with a written contract, with social service benefits, with a fixed workplace as opposed to a moving workplace, and not home-based work, but going to a place of work and working with a pakka building or a kacha building. There are all of these dimensions that define the quality of work. And all of those are extremely important, but those are important for people who already have some amount of work that they're earning their livelihoods from. Right. And finally, just the point that, many families earn their livelihoods through family enterprises. So they might have a kirana shop, or they are, farming, or there's their dairy, livestock, and things like that, right? Now, all of these enterprises that bring the livelihood to the families run on the backs of free labor provided by their women. But in the surveys, women are not counted as workers, whereas the men are. So some part of the difference that you see between male and female labor force participation rates is because women involved in economic activities but which are unpaid and unrecognized, both by their families, by their communities, and often by women themselves, because they think of it as an extension of their domestic work. So a large part of that, the male-female gap, it comes from the lack of acknowledgement or measurement of women's unpaid economic work, which is something that the PLFS is rectifying now. So part of the increase you see is because of a better recognition of that.
So I just, although women may be self-employed, when they're counted as self-employed, they're actually working on the family farm. or they're working on a family enterprise. So the difference is that the assets are owned by the men, the land is owned by the male farmers. And although you're counted as self-employed, they're not self-employed in the same way. And I think that's a big issue. And then should we also be looking at not just labor force participation, but actually earnings. So poor people are pushed out and they have high labor force participation. That's because they earn rather little and at low wages. Anyway, these are issues to be discussed. I think we'd like to open it up. Everybody's been very patient and listening, and you have lots of questions, lots of hands up. Please introduce yourself, just in a word, name and etc. And then we'll move forward. Make your comments. I know it won't be only questions, but make them brief, please. Santosh.
Santosh.
And I would also open it up to all of you.
I only have questions, Bina. My name is Santosh Mehrotra. I'm formerly a professor in JNU of Economics and formerly of the Planning Commission of India. Couple of questions to Radhika and one to Ashwini. The couple of questions to Radhika are as follows. Radhika, give us a sense. We didn't get a sense from your presentation because you were homing in a lot in your slides, particularly the maps on India, and which is very useful for many of us. Rural versus urban, that impact in terms of temperatures, if you could play a little, tell us a little bit about it, that tells you something about the rural-urban dimension of inequality, and what is the implication of urban concentrations growing, and as we move forward with heat, temperatures, ambient temperatures rising to 1.5 degrees and more, urbanization will also be happening. So that's the context. Second question to you, Radhika, is the following. We only discussed air conditioning, and Bina talked about some other things, and let me just emphasize that there still are desert coolers in homes currently, but they are not there as much as they could be. And if heat is going to be very significant in rural areas, couldn't we think about desert coolers being in some ways actually even subsidized? In my own home, in my 4-bedroom home in Delhi, I have a desert cooler which means that I don't need the AC until the end of June, because it cools my entire house. Right. So, surely in rural areas that could be. Very quickly, Bina.
I think 2 questions and then one for Ashwini, right?
Yeah, that's
then
it.
You can come back.
I've already moved to Ashwini. Ashwini, very quickly. First of all, I was extremely relieved that your and my conclusions are absolutely on the same track, and I'm glad to hear that the government thinks
external validity.
The government thinks quite otherwise. However, what I wanted to understand from you is that, of course, we are seeing a little bit of recent urban female LFPR rising. How do you explain that? It would be useful to hear from you about that. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take 3 questions for a start. Yes,
Yogesh
yourself.
from the Principal Scientific Advisor Strategic Alliances team. Stephane, my first question is to you. If you look at other countries, the fact that climate change is on us, it's a red flag. If you look at India, just building awareness about it, because we are going ahead, business as usual, it's not a red flag. And as you said, the only indicator which gets talked about is the GDP. If you could share a couple of countries where you're positively looking at a large communication where it's really now taken as something that needs to be addressed because it's critical on us, if you could share that. And Radhika, question to you in terms of the solutions that you talked about, be it passive cooling, be it in terms of technology, be it in terms of rating and retrofitting as more ACs come in, could you share some of the nudge policies that have taken place in other countries which are really optimistic and good that could be replicated, because it shows that with a policy intervention on some of the challenges you've talked about, we've seen good progress.
Thank you. And one more, and then we'll have another round. But keep them brief, okay, the 2 of you.
My name is Ravi Kaimal. I'm an architect by training, and I've done several projects which are effectively self-sufficient in energy and water and so on. So my compliments to you, Radhika Khosla, for your presentation. However, most of us practitioners don't take these categories of 1-star and 3-star and 5-star seriously. In our opinion, it's utter rubbish. The way we manage the energy efficiencies is by using totally different technologies, like VRFs and VRVs and so on, and also with temperature controls. So I don't know why this keeps coming up in academic type presentations, because in the real world, this is not taken seriously at all, neither by the professionals nor by the consumers. It makes no sense. So that is point number one. And as is happening in the UK and Japan and so on, the energy efficiencies are coming from sensible usage according to the situation. For example, in summer, the temperature is set at 26 in certain offices in Japan, because with a fan, it's a perfectly comfortable temperature as long as you're not wearing a suit and tie, you know? And similarly in UK, there's actually an active government policy to shift from furnaces to these kind of systems. Technically, they're called heat pumps, because they can pump the heat both ways. And in India, in the government in particular, we have all these rating systems. What is happening in reality? For example, this so-called World Trade Center on Ring Road is the opposite of pretty much every sensible practice for all these considerations, whether it is cost and everything else. So instead of arbitrary criteria, like either these 5 stars or these lead things and so on, for example, Ambani's multi-storied home actually qualifies to be a green building according to the American LEED standards. So these are things that need to come into the discussion, and Professor Sokolo's work from Princeton, actually his theory of slices and so on, do provide a pathway. But it needs a greater interaction between the academic world and the physical world with the practitioners. Yeah. So I would like to discuss further with you after this, if possible.
Thank you. I mean, 5-star hotels with 18 degrees, and then you have to wear woolens to be inside them. Very brief, please.
Yeah, Professor Radhika, we are talking about the climate change effect on human. We don't talk of animals, plants, birds, and other flora and fauna. That's also equally important. That makes an impact on economy also, particularly cattle, buffalo, sheep. They are also a part of our economy. The way recently COP29 had a discussion of this issue in 1.5, the carbon emission, there was supposed to be $1.3 trillion to be contributed by rich country, and they are just contributing $300 billion. And now Trump is coming again, and he may again too.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's start with these questions, and I want to, if I may, because you talked about heat and its implications of productivity, and then also informal sector workers. So there must be some things that you could say in terms of how you would deal with issues of cooling. And so, for instance, suppose you take a factory. Now you can provide a desert cooler near somewhere, or even in localized, or you heat the whole space, the roof heat, cooling, and so on and so forth. Or the institutional possibility of informal sector workers, having a common space to go to, or even a siesta, I mean, in the afternoon, where you while away the heated hours and go back to work in the evening. So I'd like to open it up to all of you, but I do want you to also come into the debate in whatever order you'd like to take it. Stephane, did you want to?
Well, I feel I really have to start by acknowledging that wearing a tie makes no sense at all.
What makes no sense?
To wear a tie. I think I'm the only one in the room, I think, so I can very safely say that, it's one of this example, and linking with the gender discussion, we have all of these discussions about air conditioning in some of the buildings being calibrated for men wearing ties, and it makes no sense, but it's part of the long list of things that we are trying to highlight that we can have for free, right? We are doing a lot of stupid things that we could stop doing, and there are a lot of opportunities to just do better things without necessarily spending more money, just by trying to spend money better and trying to be smarter about things. So I felt I had to start with the tie thing. So your question, I thank you, because one of the things that we're trying to do at the moment is to stop focusing only on recommendations, what country X and Y should do, and look more at what countries are doing, because there is so much action in the world already that we can look at what countries are doing, measuring results, highlight what works and can be replicated. And so we're doing more and more work, and that's why it's so important for us to work in all of the countries, because it's not only by working in a country we can provide ideas and data analysis and so on. It's by working in a country, we learn about what the country is doing, and then we can bring that experience to others. And of course, being in India, there's so much happening in India and so much diversity because different states are doing different things that for us, it's a great place to learn what works and to bring that to other countries, maybe at a lower income level that have a lot to learn. But as you said, especially in terms of architecture and building, at this point in time, I think it's lower income countries that have a lot to teach to higher income countries that have made a lot of mistakes. It's difficult to identify countries doing everything right. But on adaptation and resilience, what we see in all countries and all sectors, we see best practices, and what's really missing is the scale-up. So what we need is not more pilot projects. What we need is really to make good ideas just a normal way of doing business. And so communicating much more about what works is really important. And we just published a book on that. And on mitigation and emission reductions, it's the same thing. We see different countries starting to do a lot of interesting things. What I want to flag is a very clear signal on the direction of travel is essential if you want to all of the forces in the country to push in the same direction and the private sector to play its role. And I think the role of the long-term strategies, the role of long-term targets in terms of emissions and so on, is not only for the UNFCCC and the international community. It's to send a signal to all of your firms, all of your researchers, all of your investors, that this is a direction of travel and that you can build a collective movement which is much more efficient than trying to do everything with policies.
Right. Thank you. Som, did you go ahead? Okay, go ahead. Yeah. I'm just doing a different. It does.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's without the light, but it does work.
Yeah. I wanted to say that. Yeah, I think that in terms of responses, there are sort of decentralized responses and then there are global responses. And I'm afraid that with this thing, neither one by itself is going to do. So you need decentralized responses. And that means in India in particular, we need better local government. So we need to get local government functional because it's impossible for states to make plans that are implemented by localities which haven't bought into them. And I think that's really critical for things like urban housing, urban slums. These things, it's really not something you can do at national or state level because they are really very local issues. So I think that we do need, an emphasis on being able to make decisions at the local level in governments and governance for things like better building, better planning, and so on. That's one. The other thing is that, the scale of the amount of adaptation that's going to be needed is just staggering. And so we are going to have enormous losses going forward. And so we really do need global action also. And I think that one thing I would like to say, which is completely left out of the discourse everywhere that I hear, now it's starting to creep in, is that we do need to cut emissions globally at the global level. And when I say we, I mean it's the people who are doing the emitting, not the poor who are not doing the emitting. But in addition to that, and get down to net zero and all that, but in addition to that, the fact is that even with the best or most optimistic case, we're still going to see a couple of more degrees of rise, right? And yes, and I think that that's going to be impossible for most people poor people across the world in India, Africa, and so on, to adapt to, with the best of intentions and so on. So this is really serious, and I think that we do need to think about, climate engineering solutions. So when I say solutions, everybody that raises hackles, but the point is it's something to prevent the temperature from rising as fast as it is, because that really is going to be disastrous. We can adapt if the temperature rises more slowly or if it doesn't rise as much, But if it continues to rise the way it is doing, and it will, despite your trying your best efforts to cut emissions, the concentration is still rising, so temperature will still keep going up. So that also needs to get into the table. And it's not going to get into the table if governments never talk about it, if scientists don't talk about it, if bureaucrats don't talk about it, and if journalists don't talk about it. It will just not make it. And it needs to make it in there. So it has to be part of the mix, even though it's something that people don't want to do because messing with the climate has unintended consequences and so on. But we are past that stage. We've messed too much already.
Radhika? Thank you. Okay, so there were a number of questions, and I'll try to go through them quickly. And
Whichever the more important one.
sure. So urban and rural, we've not done the analysis on urban yet. I mean, this is all work in progress. But what we do know is the reason we focus on the rural is that there is globally, we know, we're looking at 80% of the world being urban in a few decades' time. So this is where majority of people are going to live. And the urban, because of a number of different effects, particularly the urban heat island effect, means that it's already so much warmer than the surrounding areas. So it just becomes a much more acute place where these problems play out and where inequalities play out. And therefore we focus on that. But I'd very much like to look at the rural as well. You talked about other approaches, and yes, of course, like desert coolers, cooling centers. There's actually in Jodhpur a cooling center that is completely off the grid, which is really interesting, right, as a space to go to for relief. And they have their own issues, and we can talk about that later. But basically using ventilation, shading, or orientation, thermal insulation. I mean, these are the scientific principles that underlie all of passive cooling approaches. And those approaches, like we were saying, there's such a long history of, it's just not the norm in terms of how we construct buildings. But there's a very rich history of these that do exist. In terms of nudge policies, there are some nice examples from around the world. Often these are tied to energy efficiency. I like a particular German example where when you are retrofitting a certain section of the house, or say building a new section of the house, you actually have to go back and put in building measures for building energy use for the whole house. So you can't make so sometimes people don't make an extension or change an extension because at the moment you have a construction piece going in, you actually have to go back and raise the bar for the whole house itself. And, it's a tough one, but it works well. And just then, on the energy efficiency and maps, and, I completely agree with you. I mean, we need so much more interaction. It is the Government of India standard, that you have energy efficiency air conditioners. It's harmonized. Well, they're not harmonized, but there's an aim to harmonize these across the world. And I see the rationale for it because, air conditioners are high energy consuming devices, and it makes sense to have them be efficient. But of course, we want a whole building approach where comfort variables are much more than just temperature. And we can talk about that after.
So Ashwini, rather than, I'll take the liberty, you guys can sort out the debate on employment. But what if one were to say that one of the perverse effects, if you like, that because women are much more in the domestic sphere, they're much less exposed to the outside. Men tend to work outside the home much more. So in relation to the issue of heating and cooling, that they would be less susceptible, at least in terms of health questions, to heat strokes and heat waves and so on than men might. So what would be your response to that?
I think one big issue that disproportionately affects women more than men is indoor air pollution. I know that Som has some work on it, and others. So
cooking fuel issue.
So they are exposed to it 24/7. Also, poorer women, the difference between pollution levels inside the home and outside the home is negligible because you're not, we think of middle class or upper middle class homes that are very nicely insulated and we sit with the air purifiers and so on. But for most people, that's not the kind of home. So it's not as though air quality inside the home is drastically better than air quality outside the home. But most of all, it's indoor air pollution. Yes. So that's a very big health hazard. In addition to adding to the ambient level of pollution outside, but it also exposes women and children particularly badly.
Right, and for that, of course, it's the nature of fuel that we are using, which is the result. So moving to clean fuels would be, and which we are moving towards in that direction. So that could be a potential, an actual solution. We are getting late. There's still questions, very quick. And Chetan, you also, why don't we, did you want to come in first? And then we'll just take one more round. It's getting late. I'll come back to you, Chetan. We won't go away. Very quickly, we'll move in this direction. Yourself and Sabyasachi, a couple of people, and we'll stop with Dr. Ghate. Please say who you are.
I'm K. Mahesh. I'm a civil servant posted in Delhi. My question is to Mr. Stephane. I just wanted to know that you talked about various dimensions when you were presenting your PPTs. But one dimension which has been overlooked by this panel is the legal framework. That are there gaps in the legal framework when we talk about all these the crisis arising out of heat waves, or you don't think there are gaps, the legal framework? Secondly, I think we need to study the relationship between the climate change and corruption, particularly in the context of developing countries. Our pollution control boards and pollution committees are some of the most corrupt departments. Just 2 months ago, one engineer in the pollution control committee in Delhi was caught with 3.5 crore cash at his residence. We have not even seen this cash in life. And this is just caught. So just imagine the level. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sabyasachi, and there's Saudamani. Shall we take her first? Because just around the corner. Yes.
Just a simple question to all of you. Yeah. So this is regarding the nature-based solution that has been really talked about, and that may be one approach, that's so suitable for the people who are so vulnerable, are living at the margin, and also this is called a no regret option. So what is your take on that?
Okay, Sabyasachi.
So, Stephane, my question is also to you. So in your experience in other countries, when it comes to adjustments and abatement, how far can we depend on markets as opposed to the state intervening? I mean, are markets providing solutions? And that's basic question.
Okay, thank you. And we'll take a couple of questions here, three questions here. Put your hands up again. Yes. No, I'm sorry. Yes, okay, very quickly.
Yeah, I work in the area of psychology, and we do talk about resilience as one of the topics when you talk about positive psychology, where we talk about protective factors and risk factors. So I was just trying to link psychology with the current discussion, where whether this migration will be regarded as a protective factor or a risk factor because of the climate change.
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Zulfi. I am a bamboo entrepreneur and recently completed bamboo entrepreneur, and recently completed my PhD from IIT Delhi on bamboo technology application. I just want to add 2 points and a question to it. Actually, there are two, like ma'am said, what are the alternatives? There are 2 alternatives available in field of construction. One is the bio-based materials, like bamboo engineered wood sandwiches. Suppose if you remove, if you replace all the wood panels here with bamboo sandwiches, you will need half the number of ACs to cool it down. And the second emerging technology is 3D printing, where we used concrete for 3D printing, reinforced with terracotta blocks. So it will be automatically cooler inside, and there will be in both cases there will be a difference of almost 20 degrees. So in Siachen we are using for army people and all. So, but the thing is, and India is a leader in it. We can do a lot of in the next 10 years. But what policy, at policy level, what should be done and how we can take up, that is a question we want to answer from the panelists.
So thank you. That's a very interesting point. You had your hand up?
Yes. I sit on the intersection of Radhika and Ravi. Since I am a practicing architect, I nearly got taught by her at Oxford. So the thing is...
Nearly.
Yes, nearly. She started to teach in my course a little later since I passed out. Anyway, the point is how much of the national building code or our building code, how accommodating it is to passive cooling. That is a question that needs to be asked. And like he said, star ratings, any star rating, whether it's LEEDs or BREEAM or 3-star, green star, nobody looks at it seriously. But ultimately, that is how these buildings get their additional FARs. So building codes, I think, need to be researched on. What are the changes that need to be done in that? Then his question, these technologies are good or bad, I don't know, but schedule of rates are not supportive. When you will do your building analysis as to what is the building going to cost, then there is a method how these analyses are done, and they don't support it. So most of these innovative methods, I think there needs to be a lot of research on that portion, and how much of it are the academics doing them.
So I think that's a good conversation the two of you could also have, and I'll take that as comment. Chetan? And then Suraj, and then yourself, and then we close. Did you? Yes.
So first, I really enjoyed all the talks, and I'm glad, Ashwini, you spoke about non-climate related resilience. If resilience means coping with risks and also means raising incomes, then that means you need to have growth, right? So, but when you look at Som's work, potential growth is going to plummet in developing countries because potential growth is hours work plus productivity. And hours worked is going to plummet because people don't sleep, and productivity is going to plummet because they're too tired to work. So potential growth is going to plummet in that story. But Stephane's version is that we may be able to get growth from having smart growth with smart green investments, assuming we have the financing for it. And therefore, possibly growth may not be a concern if we can do it. And therefore, this could be the silver lining in this entire problem, that it could be a huge opportunity for developing countries like India to be able to sustain their growth rates. So I was just wondering if everyone had a view, anybody on the panel had a view on that. And the second question is, how do all of you think of what the welfare state should be going forward? There's a lot of discussion in India about freebies and dole and, take those away and so on. So are we now going to pivot towards more social insurance, scaled up crop insurance, universal? We have these loan waivers done periodically, but you could argue that if you had subsidized the crop insurance, that would have been cheaper if everybody had gotten the crop insurance and allowing for the loan waiver to be given, and with all the moral hazard problems associated with it. So just a sense of where do you all think the welfare state is going to go? What is it going to be redone as, or if it will be? Thank you.
Okay, just behind you, Suraj, very quickly, and then
Hi.
Sal.
Yeah, my name is Suraj Kumar. I have a vested interest because I'm trying to write a prospectus for a slim volume on SDGs beyond 2030. My question is, it's straightforward. India had this so-called India Cooling Action Plan, 2019, serial years. Is there a good evaluation of what has been done? Because we are looking at the recommendations, etc. So is there any independent analysis that has been done? Because when you read the reports, they flag the issue, but they don't really talk much about, different sectors get focused, but you don't get a sense of how things have moved. So is there any independent evaluation?
Thank you. And just pass it on. There's a gentleman there with two hands up.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. Very interesting discussion.
And you are?
I'm Anand. I worked for the government a couple of years back.
Okay.
Anyway, so since the question is all about in the context of resilience and also inequality, I think one of the important programs that the government runs is on housing, especially for the poor. Now, I can just share small anecdote, if you see the entire design, almost nowhere it is tuned to the local materials or local needs. Mostly it is use of GI sheets. In fact, so much so that when I traveled in eastern sector, some of the women were using it for poultry because the temperature was in the range of 50 degrees. I'm talking about a specific state, I won't name it. So I think this is very important, especially somebody mentioned bamboo. In fact, bamboo is not been used except Meghalaya. They have actually had demos, but nowhere is the Awas Yojana programs actually using local materials. That's one. Second is on the concept of, I'm happy that there was a mention of asset-based approach to resilience versus the welfare approach. I think that was the first presentation, very interesting. I think somewhere in that, the assets are private assets. And we also need to look at the distribution of public assets, which means especially land. If you see any urban area, use of public spaces is typically, all the poorer households are typically next to the riverside or in the low-lying floodplain. No parks. In fact, there are no parks. That is public space again. So how is public goods, how are they distributed? That's also equally important from the point of view of measuring resilience. Absolutely. Not just the measurement of private assets like air conditioners or whatever it be. Thank you.
Right, absolutely. And recreation of commons. Absolutely. Recreation of commons. So we have a full plate, very quick. And I did want to say to both of you, you seem to assume that urbanization is the future. Why? There are a lot of people who want to go back to rural areas. They say we want to build back better. We want to create our own food. I'm just saying that are there alternative visions from the standard Arthur Lewis approach that people will move from rural to urban areas and they'll move to industry and services and decline in agriculture and so on? Is there a way to reimagine a future? Whether it's implemented or not is another issue. But I think what you're also saying is let's reimagine the way we build and think. So over to all of you. Ashwini, shall we start with you this time?
I'll just respond actually to Chetan's point about growth. You know, I mean, there are all these estimates where if women increase the paid labor force, you know, GDP is going to grow. So if everything else remains as before and women entered paid labor force, there's going to be a multiple effect on the GDP of India. So that's just in terms of female labor force participation and GDP. The question of, you know, what is going to be welfare state going forward. So if you look at the sort of the bottom 30 to 40%, all the schemes that one either supports or doesn't, depending on where one is placed in this debate, they are applicable really to the bottom 30 to 40% of people. And the very rich, of course, they don't, you know, they have other kinds of support, either through, you know, taxation or many other ways in which, or they don't need support. That's also because they've privatized, they've sort of opted out of the public system. And so it's really thinking of what will happen to the middle part and also to the bottom. I mean, what is our conception? So for example, for women, they always say, well, there's NREGA work. You can always do NREGA work. But think of a woman who studied up to class 8 or class 10. She doesn't necessarily want to do manual labor at minimum wage, you know, out in the field. Nothing wrong with that, but her aspirations have also increased. So to think of everybody as just a labharthi or a welfare recipient doesn't also always correspond to what their aspirations are, as will happen with a growing society with, you know, higher levels of education. So how does one balance the need for a safety net and a welfare state for those who genuinely need it, but along with opportunities for paid work and expression of their productive potential? I think that's the challenge, really.
Yes. So that's it. Thank you. So
I'll pass.
You'll pass. Stephane, and yeah. And pick up anything, but also the welfare state question and the issue of growth and what kind of growth.
It's okay. You have 90 minutes.
No, we have 3 minutes. I'm giving you a minute and a half.
Okay, so that won't happen.
And also an alternative vision from an economist and from the bank as well.
An alternative vision for the future of the world in 1 minute and a half. Just
1 minute and a half.
Hope you have your seatbelt. Can I add a little side points, because it hasn't been mentioned, but when we look at the gender difference in impacts, one thing that we find that is really, really important is that children are very vulnerable. And when children are sick, women in most of the world are the ones keeping work. And in our estimates on poverty, this factor through childcare or elderly care was really one of the dominating factor, much more than the occupational one. I just wanted to mention that. I don't know if it's true in all countries, but it's clearly an important factor. So I'll try to connect different questions, but so you ask about the fact that we need growth, but at the same time we have these impacts on labor productivity. I think that's why we have been framing a lot of this question as a race, right? You have to accelerate development because impacts will be increasing over time, and it's kind of like easier to do the development now than trying to extract people in very dire situations in 20 to 30 years. So if there is one reason to get more development aid and development finance, I think climate is one of the reasons for that. It makes poverty reduction even more, I mean, it was already super urgent, and the delay is unacceptable compared with what the commitment we had for 2030, but it's even more urgent because of climate. And one thing, we're doing those country diagnostics, CCDRs in all countries, and one thing we see is in lower income countries, most of the impacts are direct impact on people and their productivity. In richer countries, most of the impacts are extreme events on infrastructure systems, and it's much easier to adapt to the latter. And so, I mean, I talked a lot about the inequalities within countries, but the inequality across countries are also extremely important, and that justifies, I think, more support and to try to go farther. So it's not really a solution, but the fact that we really have to mobilize, and the fact that we really need to reduce emissions. Okay. And I think we are losing a lot of time with, I think, big, abstract debates about green growth and so on. I think at one point it's really important to just do the job. And I think now we have policies, we see them working in many countries and so on, and kind of past the time of the abstract discussions. And that's why I think focusing on what works in countries and replicating as fast as we can is good. We have agreed on everything in this panel. I have to disagree with some on the geoengineering. I thought I would mention it. To me, there are huge geopolitical and environmental risks in going there, but we don't have time in the -2 minutes I have left.
You don't have 2 minutes. You're already
minus 2 minutes,
oh.
I said. And just on the markets and the legal framework and so on, I mean, those things are really, really important. What we're trying to flag very strongly is the complementarity. And I'll just give you 2 very quick examples. Everybody's talking about carbon price to create the right incentives. At the same time, very often the legal framework or the regulations makes even cost-effective solutions without a carbon price are not implemented, and because they are blocked by regulations. In Costa Rica, electric buses were cheaper, but the price of a bus ticket was determined by the diesel expenditures of the company. So you couldn't have an electric bus. It was basically impossible just because of a regulation. You remove the regulation, electric buses are coming in. That's the type of things that we need to capture. And we also need investments from the government, so it's also answering the question on the public assets. If you're looking at transport infrastructure and transport emissions, a carbon price is twice as efficient if you have public transport in a city. And so it's not only about changing the price and using the markets, the government also needs to support investment in the infrastructure to create alternative for people to respond to the price. Otherwise, they just pay the price and it doesn't really help. Yeah. So I think I'll stop there.
Stop there. Radhika, very quickly.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to take all those questions, but just on your point, is the future urban? The present is definitely urban, right? So about a decade ago, more than 50% of the world's population started living in cities. That number is only rapidly going up, and it's about sort of 30, if we follow those trends, in the next 30, 40 years or so, it's 80% of the world will be urban. So of course, I think we always have to stop and say, are there other visions of the future, and welcome them. But I think there's also something to be said about what we know in terms of the trends that, we are moving towards, and how we plan for those that we have a little bit more certainty about.
Okay. So we'll have to bring this very rich discussion to a close. I just want to add one point, apropos the last comment. I think one of the things that we need to move away from is, can we think of more recreating the commons? Now the commons have disappeared in terms of the forests and commons and rural commons. They got privatized over long periods of time. There's a lot of evidence of that. But we recreate the commons in other ways. So we could recreate it in terms of farming. I've been working on group farming, for instance. Can we think of it in terms of cooling? So shelters, etc. Architecturally, can you create spaces which are more communal rather than everybody having, even in terms of ownership, property rights, we tend to think of people having their own flat. Whereas we need to think differently about that. Child care and elder care, which tends to be such a burden if it's individual, doesn't need to be individual. So again, are there communal solutions? And I think we need to rethink of living as communities rather than individuals who are then occasionally we come together in a room like this or go to a center and just to interact for a little while. And I would say that would be a part of the vision. During the period of COVID, we recreated community. People were feeding each other. There was a lot of cooperation, if not a commons. But perhaps that's part of the vision, I would say, perhaps we need to think about. So there are two levels of thanks. I want to first thank a whole range of people. Chetan, of course, we in the organizing of the symposium, there was a lot of cooperation, interaction, discussion, democratization of decision making. So Chetan Ghate, Sukhdeep Singh, Sandhya Garg, Gautam, Professor Sodamani, and then another layer of people, Akriti, Parag Sharma, Nirmal, Mr. Sahu, Vandana, and many others. So I thank you very much. And then, of course, this is the quiet labor. And thank you very much for the 4 panelists for a very rich, very engaged discussion. Of course, this is a subject this is only the start. And actually, Chetan suggested, when we're thinking of what shall we have a symposium on, he said, well, let's have it on resilience. And look how much that has thrown up. So I also thank, although some of you they are present, some are not, there are a number of students here who presented terrific posters at the IG. There were keynote speakers. Stephane was one. There was Ms. Chandni, who talked about climate finance, who gave a special address. So we thank them all. And with that, I pass it on to my young colleague here, Sukhdeep, who will formally give a vote of thanks.
So hope everybody enjoyed this engaging and thought-provoking panel discussion. So Professor Bina Agarwal has already thanked most of us, but formally I would say that on behalf of IEG, I especially thank Dr. Stephane Hallegatte. He came all the way to deliver a keynote address in IEG symposium, and also he participated in this panel discussion. I also thank all the speakers and chair, Professor Bina Agarwal, Professor Chetan Ghate, and a special thanks goes to Professor Ghate and Professor Bina Agarwal. They have led the organizing team with their unwavering guidance and expertise. And apart from that, a lot of people have worked. Professor Sudamani Das, for instance, Gautam Das, and my colleague Sandhya Garg, they have contributed a lot in this. And I also extend my gratitude to the director's office, central office, finance officer, computer unit, library staff of the IG for their unwavering support.
And the cooling system, the ACs.
Yeah, the AC. So finally, So I thank all of you, our esteemed guests, participants, and audience members for your presence and engagement. And with that, I would like to say that we
I
look.
just want to interrupt you and thank for the IIC, and Mr. Sumit is sitting there, and also, of course, the whole IIC team and so on. Thank you.
So we look forward to welcoming you to future events organized by IG. Thank you once again.
Thank you for coming.